My guest today is Jack Neely, who is the walking index of Knoxville. You're really our historian, and I'm so happy to have you here today.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here. Yeah.
So most people know you, as a writer, executive director of the Knoxville History Project, but this had to start somewhere. So let's talk about, how did your love of history and of Knoxville history get started?
Yeah. Well, I was interested in history as a kid, and I didn't know how you could not be interested in history. It was the history of stories of things that happened long ago, and it's the stories of how things started to become the way they are now. But I, in my family, was interested in history. Would take us to other places that were historic, obviously historic places. And Chattanooga was a place we went several times, and they had so much Civil War history. And I loved to walk on the battlefields at Missionary Ridge and all that. And then in Charleston, we'd go to Charleston, and such obvious history, a beautiful city with really it just reeks of history. And in Nashville too, we had family there, and I knew all this, the stories about the assassinations and things in downtown Nashville and all this growing up. But I never heard that much about Knoxville history, and I came to assume that Knoxville just didn't have quite as exciting history as these other places did, because our Civil War battle was very small compared to the Battle of Chattanooga and all the other. It just seemed like a part of our sort of inferiority in a way. But over the years, I started to realize that there were lots of interesting things that happened here that didn't happen other places, and started connecting dots and putting things together. But I was really a journalist, and I was a journalist for most of my career, and worked in print journalism, worked for Whittle Communications for 6 years, and as an editor there. And then was in. It was kind of coming apart when Metropulse was starting, and I worked for Metropulse, our free weekly paper that was here for not long enough.
That is a part of when I first got to Knoxville. My then boyfriend, now husband, that was our thing, to get the new Metropulse, to see what was going on.
It was exciting, maybe too exciting, because it was not really a career path for a middle-aged guy. But I just enjoyed it so much, and I enjoyed that Thursday it came out, because I would go to a bar downtown and just watch people picking up the paper and reading it, and they would laugh, and they would point at it and want to show it to their friends. And just it was fun to see, just sitting alone at a bar watching people respond to what I'd been working on. And that was, and it was, we were wide open. We wrote about anything as long as it happened in Knoxville, and it was, to me, it was just so much fun. But didn't have a retirement plan, didn't have a medical plan, and all the things I really should have been looking for at age 35 or 40 or 50. But still, it was, we worked long hours, but enjoyed every minute of it. And but that was it was an important thing in Knoxville. I think it was part of what happened in Knoxville in the last 25 or 30 years. But yeah, that was the biggest part of my career as well. Almost 20 years at Metropulse, and then the Metropulse, of course, was bought by a corporation, and they pulled the plug on it, and it was shocking to me, because we were winning awards. We were winning even national awards sometimes. We were actually not losing money. We were sometimes making a profit, which in our early days we were lost every year, but we just had owners who wanted to keep it going. Mm-hmm. But corporations, they want a profit, and they want this bigger profit, and they were insisting on that from us, and I didn't think that they would just shut us down completely, but they did, to try to replace us with something that was purely profitable. So we. That was about 10 years ago when I was left kind of squirming in the dust in my 50s, and but I'd begun writing at Metropulse this column called Secret History, and it was interesting. When I worked at Whittle Communications, I began writing Secret History. I was working, my day job was working for this national magazine, glossy magazine, that they said went to this many million people every month, and that sounded impressive, but I didn't hear it from these people very much. You know, they didn't write in, they didn't call. It was just something that was in doctors' waiting rooms and other places that the people would happen to see a magazine with ads and pick it up and might or might not read something that I'd worked on. But I began writing for Metropulse and writing this column called Secret History back in '92, and I was, even though I was still working for Whittle at the time, I was getting more calls from my Metropulse column, just a local paper, a free paper, which I really just did as a favor to a friend, than I was getting to my main job, and that was gratifying to me to hear that people were reading something and finding it interesting or laughing at it or whatever, and that they wanted to share that with me, and that was how I really got into it. And I was just lucky that when Whittle came apart, I landed in Metropulse, and that was, even though it was not the same salary, it was not, it was a completely different realm. It was gratifying, which is what a journalist likes to be. A writer likes people to read his or her stuff, and that was what's happening with Metropulse.
So how did you pivot? Because you know, what you were writing were shorter forms than like the books that you eventually started getting into.
Yeah.
How did you pivot into this?
Well, actually, the publisher of Metropulse, Rand Pearson, in '95, I'd written a lot of these columns, and he said, "These look like a book to me, and why don't you put all these in a book?" And I said, "Gosh, how about that? Maybe pick my 50 most favorite columns and put them in a book." And we did that in '95, and that was the first Secret History book. And I was really surprised. It flew off the shelves. It was, there were lines. I had no clue. This was not something I had ever been around before. Lines at book signings and things like that. And then it was such a success, we did a second one. And it, anyway, but that one thing led to another. And I liked, in writing short form, Metropulse would have mostly short form. The columns were just 800 or 1,000 words typically, but I was known for wanting to go a little bit farther, and I would write 3,000 word feature stories, 5,000 words, once even a 12,000 word feature story, which is like a New Yorker story. But Metropulse was so flexible that they would sometimes allow that sort of thing, and that you're getting up into almost book range at that time. So I began, I did write a few books as books after that, and sometimes a feature story would turn into a book that way.
So a lot of times people who are historians have like a certain thing, like that, this is the one thing they're focused on, but you're really broad. Like you can talk about all of Knoxville. Do you have a favorite, like a favorite figures or people throughout our history where you go, this one here, every time?
Yeah, well, there's so many interesting, and it tends to be the people who are misunderstood that I'll look at again and again, who are not very well known. People like Adolph Ochs, who was Ochs, O-C-H-S. He's a major figure. A lot of people may not recognize his name, but he was the guy that founded the modern New York Times. But he grew up in Knoxville, and this is really surprising to people, son of Jewish Bavarian refugee immigrants who grew up in the streets of Knoxville in the 1850s and 60s and 70s, and was a kid here, was born in Cincinnati, but his parents moved here soon after. But he began working for newspapers, first as a carrier, as I was once. I was once a paper boy back in the bicycle paper boy period, and I was one of the last, I guess, of that ilk. But he was a paper boy, and then he became a printer's devil, which is an apprentice printer, a guy that worked night shift, setting type to print this first weekly, then daily paper. But he decided he could run a paper himself. He left here, went first to Chattanooga, with some partners who had some money, bought a paper in Chattanooga, made it a great paper, the Chattanooga Times, and then in his 30s decided he could do the same thing in New York, and he bought a failing paper called the New York Times in 1896 and built it up, and also changed New York as he created Times Square and to celebrate the times. And he started the Times Square New Year's Eve show, and he created the New York Times as we know it with all the literary weekly and the magazine and all these things. These were all his ideas, and even the motto of the Times, "All the news that's fit to print," is one that he borrowed from his cousins, the Blaufelds, who are also Jewish Bavarian immigrants who came over here, who had a shop on Gay Street called "All the Cigars That Are Fit to Smoke," and that was that he said, "What, this could work for a newspaper too, so you mind if I borrow this?" But he became, the New York Times became a major leader, and I love the fact that his parents were both immigrants, but they were on different sides of the Civil War, because his mother, even though she was from Germany, she had an uncle who was a planter in Mississippi, and she was on the Confederate side. Her husband was a Union soldier. He had joined the Union Army, but when they lived in Cincinnati, he was training Union troops while she was smuggling medical supplies to the Confederates in Kentucky. And amazing they stayed together. But But Adolph Fox grew up in this household, and he said, "You got to be fair. You got to talk, explain both sides." And that was, I think, one of his strengths as a newspaper man, was that he tried to tell the whole story.
How hard is it to gather this information? It's got to be easier now with the advancement of technology. But you started this back when microfilm and looking at old photos.
Yeah. Some things are easier to find now, certainly, and I think especially newspapers online has changed the way we research things a lot. But there are a lot of things that are not online yet and may never be online, and a lot of the stories about people like Adolph Fox are stories that are memories that people typed up in the 1920s and put in a file, and they're just in a library somewhere. And that's a lot of the details about his life. And there's also a lot of Wikipedia is great, but it's very flawed. There are a lot of things that are not exactly true there. It may be better every year, but there are. It's often written by people with access to grind or something, or with people or with great uncles they want people to remember or something, and they're not completely objective, I guess I should say, and but it's still useful. It's still useful for context and so forth. But to find the whole story, you really need to dig in lots of different places, and the McClung Collection downtown is just a great resource. A lot of cities bigger than Knoxville don't have something like the McClung Collection, which is really I think most people use it for genealogy, but it's got a lot of information about a lot of different subjects, and they do use, of course, computers too, but they have files and files and files. Their obituary files, their business files, all these things that people in 1948 tucked in a file that think somebody might be interested in this, and it's not until now that you actually pull that little clipping out and look at it and find it. Yes, this does make a connection.
Those missing little pieces.
Yeah.
So we have to talk about music and the music scene, because that country music, that's the thing everybody's talking about right now. Knoxville has its place in the country music history files. Yes, country music and other kinds of music too. And it's surprising how much overlap there is between country and other things, blues and jazz and even opera. And this is we're working on right now on a music history guide, and we hope to have it out in early 25. That is going to be a kind of an index to everything that you might be interested in finding out about music in Knoxville, because there are a lot of assumptions people make, a lot of truisms people tell, stories people tell about music in Knoxville, about how Nashville stole this or that, and I've heard that.
they're mostly not exactly true, but what is true is this. The evolution of music interest here, and music before the Civil War was kind of like a novelty. There'd be a banjoist in town, and people would come and crowd around him, and it would be quite in that interesting and fun. and then there would be like Tom Thumb, the dwarf would come here and sing, and people would go, "Gosh, isn't that amazing?" But that was what music was. It was just something that happened every once in a while before the Civil War. But after the Civil War, we had all these German immigrants in town, all these Irish immigrants in town, all these Welsh immigrants in town, who were here to work for the new industries. Knoxville was growing really fast because of the arrival of the railroads in the 1850s, and suddenly we had a lot of industry. And we had immigrants. We had recently freed African American people who were here and doing their own kinds of music, and it was all kind of blending together in interesting ways. And we had these street fairs and things like that that brought all these things together. And but the Germans were kind of the leaders of a lot of this. German-speaking people, both from Bavaria and other places, from Leipzig, from Switzerland, from other places, were here in Knoxville. And Peter Staub, who was from Switzerland, built the Opera House in 1872, partly to greet the demand that had already been created by something called the Knoxville Philharmonic Society, which was founded by a guy from Leipzig named Gustav Knabbe, who was a guy who had played horn in Mendelssohn's orchestra in Leipzig. And he wanted to start a classical music thing here in Knoxville, because he'd been part of this wave of refugees who'd come here after the revolutions of 1848 were such a failure. But he started this local thing that became really popular among local people, among newcomers, everybody. And by the 1870s, we were having opera in downtown Knoxville, and they kept trying to build on it. In the 1880s, they started a music festival, and you would think a music festival in East Tennessee would be banjos and fiddles,
right?
But this was all operatic singing. It was all vocal singing, and they had stars from Europe coming here for this. They had the Boston Philharmonic was here. Victor Herbert, the famous composer, was here. A lot of very famous people were here for this annual festival. It was a 4-day festival. I compare it to Big Ears in a way.
See, I was going to say Rossini Fest. That's our first Rossini festival.
Well, exactly, and Rossini was very popular here in the 19th century. One of the first operas we heard were Rossini operas, but also Gilbert and Sullivan, all sorts of operas they had here. But that caught on, and one of these festivals in 1883. I love this story, and it's going to be on our guide. In May of 1883, they had a lot of sopranos, a lot of orchestras were playing one after another, and most of it was in Staub's Opera House on Gay Street. Some of it was out in public and at Challoway Park, which was fairly new at that time. But they had the very last event of this opera festival. They had a surprise. They said, "We have something a little bit different now," and they brought out a bunch of old-time fiddlers, these elderly men who weren't used to anybody paying attention to what they were doing, and they came out and had a little fiddling contest, playing like old school, 200-year-old fiddle tunes from England and Ireland and other places in America, from Arkansas Traveler, that kind of thing. They just started playing fiddle tunes, and the audience dressed in tuxedos and dresses
Gowns,
were delighted with this and loved it. And this started this tradition of fiddling contests in Knoxville that really eventually kind of bloomed on Market Square a few years after that. But that was really kind of the beginning of interest in country music. Meanwhile, there were street musicians, a lot of them blind people. You wouldn't become a musician unless you were disabled in those days, because there wasn't much of a way to make a living. But blind people could learn music often better than other people could. And a lot of these early blind musicians, George Renaud, Charlie Oakes, Mac and Bob, were just playing blues or country tunes in the street, and they were and this is an interesting business story, when Sturkey Brothers Furniture, which sold phonographs, and of course phonographs were furniture. They look like furniture. They have big pieces of wood, and they observed that they thought phonographs they used to be expensive things for rich people. Now they're much less expensive, like all technology. It becomes less expensive as years go by. But working people aren't buying these things. Why aren't they? And they said, well, it's because all the music is opera and stuff, and they don't care for that music. Why don't we start recording these guys in the streets who are playing for nickels, and people enjoy it. They're giving them nickels, so maybe they would spend their nickel on a record. And this was Mr. Sturkey's idea to send them to New York and make records there. Of course, nobody was making records in the South in those days. Nashville wasn't a recording place until the 1950s, really. But this is the 1920s we're talking about. And he sent them on the train up to New York to make records. These guys who had never been outside of this region before were suddenly in the big city making records, and included Uncle Dave Macon was one of those people, banjo player. But Sturkey sent up there to make records, and it caught on. And this is before the famous Bristol sessions, which were very important, with the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers and all those. But this was like 3 or 4 years before that, and suddenly we had all these Knoxville buskers, basically, who were in New York making records, and some of them sold, and some of them made a living on it for a few years. But some of them came back to town, and then they were just street musicians again. But there are some kind of poignant stories there. But that interesting business turn of we're trying to sell phonographs, and records are phonograph accessories, and we want to sell records too. To buy a record in the 1920s, you go to a furniture store. So that was how that all started, here at least. It started in different places, other places, but the Sturkey Brothers Furniture had a massive chain of stores across the South, and like 60-something stores. So they were that was a significant event when Sturkey Brothers Furniture started selling country records in 1924.
You're like a computer with like 1,000 tabs open. How do you remember all of this stuff?
I hope I'm better than that. But I can remember anything except my phone number. Honestly, I was yesterday. I was at the bank. Somebody said, "What's your phone number?" I said, "I don't know."
Do you have a piece of history that has frustrated you because you can't put it together? You can't piece it?
Oh, there are actually lots of things like that. I'm trying to.
Give me the one that just kind of makes you go, gosh, I just can't figure this one little bit of Knoxville out or East Tennessee out.
Yeah. There are some of those early fiddlers I would like to find out more about, how they made the connection between that event in 1883 and the fiddling contest later on. There's some dots I haven't connected yet. I've got so many of those that this afternoon I'll say, why didn't I mention that one? Because this is an opportunity to put it out there. But there are. I'm sorry. I'm having a hard. I'm kind of
because
blanking
you've got
on
so
that.
many stories. I don't even. Yeah. I couldn't even imagine that you have anything that's pretty unfinished at this point.
Yeah. There are a lot of gaps, in kind of missing pieces in our story, and a lot of it has to do with black people in Knoxville history that often they're mentioned but not by name. And if we could find out who these people are, there's one guy that appears in Suttree who's named Walter, and he's a blind dobroist on Market Square. And my friend Wes Morgan is convinced that everything and there's nothing made up in the novel Suttree, that they're all real people. And I don't know for sure who this Walter character is, and that would be interesting to find out. But there are lots of mentions of black artists, and the problem is that reporters would go in and they would be complimentary. They would say, "This is wonderful stuff," but they wouldn't mention their names, and they wouldn't mention anything about it. So when they did mention their names, they didn't mention anything about them, where they lived or what they did for a living. And we often they're just big. They're big, interesting gaps that we may or may not be able to fill in some of these, and we have been able to fill in some of them. So it's the more you look, the more likely you are to find something. There are some things, though, that are just lost to history completely, and it's hard to know that there is a clue out there, but you keep looking anyway.
When you talk about Black history here in Knoxville, I have to think of my friend, the late Bob Booker, who I got the chance to interview for this show as well.
Oh, good.
Talk a little bit about the work, because he, was a historian as well, and really pulled together a lot of those stories.
Yeah. He was a historian who had made history. That I always say that about Bob. He made history before he became a historian, both as a civil rights activist in 1960 and later on in the state legislature and city council, other places, and worked for the mayor. He was very much part of Knoxville history for most of his life, and then he became a historian, working for the Beck Center and writing all the great books that we have all of his books and refer to them in our research. But he was also became a friend and did a lot of things with us over the years. And every time I had a question, have you ever heard of this person? And he would always have, if he couldn't answer it, he could tell me where to look for it. And when I had a question about, especially about Knoxville College or about early musicians or about civil rights, and he was interested in both the civil rights era that he knew about, but also the civil rights era after the Civil War that he learned about, and the fact that as he pointed out to me, we had Black people on city council in the late 1860s, and Knoxville may have had one of the first biracial city councils in the history of the world. This is kind of amazing to think about, because we had, thanks to Parson Brownlow and his kind of extreme version of Reconstruction that applied only to Tennessee, Black men got the right to vote here really early, when Black men could not vote in most northern states even. So this was by 1869. We had not only a significant Black populace to vote for people, but we allowed them to vote too, and that was the reason that Knoxville, Nashville, and Chattanooga, I think, are the earliest 3 biracial city councils that I've ever heard of anywhere in America, and maybe the whole world, because that just didn't happen that much, to have Black and white people on the same governmental board. So that was not that it was fair or anything, but it was significant.
That's right.
But it was that was true for a long time until 1912, when we changed the way our city council worked, and there was about 50 years after that in the 20th century that we didn't have Black people on city council, but for about 50 years, 60 years after the Civil War, we did. So
when I hear you tell all these stories, what does this do for you in terms of, this is fulfilling work? You can tell this is not just, I'm going to go clock in and clock out. You love this. I really do.
Why? I really do. And I think it's probably just growing up. For one thing, I'm interested in almost everything, and Knoxville gives me a chance to, it's like a pinhole to look at everything that's known in the world in a way, because there's hardly any subject that you can name that Knoxville doesn't have some connection to. And but also, it's growing up in a city that didn't think much of itself. Knoxville was not a city that was proud of itself. And when I was a kid, and all my friends growing up said, "We're going to move somewhere else. We're going to go to Atlanta. We're going to Nashville. We're going to New York or somewhere else." And some people did. And I think probably fewer than half of the people I went to high school with are anywhere near town. But it's but you heard that all the time. There were Knoxville jokes, Knox Patch and all this stuff, and it was like Knoxville was kind of left out. And it was finding all these examples, contrary examples that are, break the mold, that change our perspectives completely about this city. Not only is Knoxville not left out, but it's one of the most, I think, integral places in America, because it combines everything. It's north and south and east and west and black and white and rich and poor and all this. You see a combination here that you don't see in a lot of other places. Some other places, yes, but it's, I think we see almost all the dynamics, good and bad, positive, negative, in American history in Knoxville. You can point to anything. I like to talk to social studies teachers and in high schools, because I like to tell them that you can study all of American history in Knoxville just by driving around and pointing at things. This is where this happened. if you're talking about suffrage, it's easy to point to Market Square and other places where in the Fairgate Hotel where these things happened, the courthouse, and this is where this happened. You can talk about prohibition. You can talk about civil rights. You can talk about everything and say this it happened right here. And talk about any figure in American history. Martin Luther King, he spoke right there, and it's and all the, and Teddy Roosevelt, he was right there, and so it's I think this could help kids remember things if they can associate with an experience and with a place they're familiar with, and say, yeah, that's where this happened. They can read and history is not that confusing if you were able to personalize it that way.
What is your proudest moment throughout your career?
Proudest moment?
Yeah, with doing
goodness.
this work, what stands out?
Oh my!
You got several. From what I've researched, you've got several.
Yeah. It seems like I'm always moving on to the next thing is when I get to one thing. Gosh, putting out a book is a relief, but also it's stressful too, because every time I've ever made a book, I open it up and the first thing I notice is a typo or something in there, and even after having been over it 8 or 9 times.
It's like doing a story.
Yeah. But that's certainly gratifying to have a good book that you're proud of about. But
you have an honorary doctorate. I thought that would be the first thing you
said. That was something at Maryville College. That's right. I did some work on Maryville College history a few years ago, and I've done a few other things with them since then. And that was really gratifying to get an honorary doctorate. 5 years ago or so, and that was something. I've gotten the Distinguished Alumnus Award from UT History Department, and the Friend of Architecture Award from the local Architecture Institute folks, and but lots of things like that, and I never quite know how to respond. There's usually a speech involved, but that's always fun.
Do you ever get tired of people asking you questions? You got to think you get a lot of random questions, like, since I had you here, my grandmother.
I always look forward to it. Yeah, I always look forward to those questions, and often often they lead me into something that I don't know, and I would and that's good too. I always like to add to the dots that I'm connecting, but yeah, it is gratifying, but that's what we're here for now. For a long time, when people would call me the official or unofficial historian or something, I would say, no, I'm a journalist. And for 30 years, I was a journalist. And I'm just writing about this because it's background for what's happening now. You can't understand what's happening now unless you know the background of it. And that's what I did repeatedly at Metropolis. I would always shrug off the title historian. But after Metropolis was shut down and we founded the Knoxville History Project, I had to admit that yes, now I am a full-time professional historian, and that's what I've been doing since then. But that's really it was kind of a lifeboat for me, because to be suddenly unemployed without a severance package at age 56, and you got to do something, and I was lucky to have a couple thousand friends who wanted to help found the Knoxville History Project as a 501c3 nonprofit, and that's what we do now, and it's turned out to be it had never been done before, and I wasn't sure it would be a full-time job that could pay for itself, but it's proving to be. There's enough interest, both out of curiosity and for practical purposes, because we sometimes do jobs for architects and developers who are trying to get historic tax credits, and we do narrative histories of things just to help explain sometimes to city council the background of, like the Cal Johnson building or something like that we put all this together, and there's enough demand for this for both practical and just cultural purposes that we are making a living at it, and it's I hope a permanent institution that we founded, regardless of what happens to me in the next 20 years. But it's that in itself has been gratifying to see. I'm not saying I would do it again. It's hard. It's hard to start a nonprofit. And
I can only imagine.
We had a lot of
Bumps along the way?
a lot of bumps, yeah, especially in that first year or so. But I appreciate the people who stuck with it through all that and made it happen. But we're now in our place in kind of our subterranean lair, I call it, down in the underground Gay Street area is where our current offices are.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Did you all do something recent with Dolly in terms of music, getting information on her music? Was that related to the work you all are doing, or is that the McClung?
No. Yeah, that was she ended up kind of unexpectedly at the History Center.
Okay.
That when she was here doing that thing for the Bijou.
Right.
I've wished for an interview with Dolly for years and applied for it, and they're always very nice. They're always very polite and the closest thing I came to it was when she answered a couple of questions indirectly through someone else for me about where she performed and where she remembered performing as a kid in Knoxville. But that was a cool thing. She did the Bijou, and that's going to be part of our music guide. Our music guide is comprehensive. It starts the earliest references to an ad for violins for sale in 1797. In Knoxville, and that tells us something, not very much, but tells us something about their interest in music. But it goes up into the modern era, and there are people who are up to Dolly and beyond. There are people who are playing in clubs in the 21st century who are now significant musicians who are going to be in the guide as well. But it's we're trying to cover all kinds of music and show how it all kind of funnels together here in this place called Knoxville.
So we have to talk about the World's Fair. You played a part in the World's Fair. Yeah.
It was fun, unexpectedly, accidentally, sort of, because I graduated from UT in '81 and. I couldn't find a job. There was a kind of a micro recession going on at the time, and nobody was hiring for anything. And I was applying for jobs as bellhops and truck assistants and things like that, and not getting them. And here I was. I had a college degree, a diploma, and couldn't do a damn thing with it. And but I began working about 6 months after my grand graduation, stuffing envelopes for the World's Fair, just doing promotional stuff, and just sending them out. We were sending brochures around the country, and I got to learn about a lot of towns I'd never heard of that way. But and then later on was on a phone bank, and that was horrible. But then I trying to connect people with housing, and housing was one of the big disasters of the World's Fair. But I heard that they were hiring crowd control assistants. The first few days of the fair, they had a lot of crowd problems, fights and mobs and stuff, and people trying to cram themselves into, because everybody was there for a day and they wanted to see everything, and they all wanted to jam into every place there was. And of course the China Pavilion, and everybody wanted to see the China Pavilion. And they had hours long lines there. And they said, we need to get some crowd control people here. And they hired about 7 or 8 guys to wear red shirts and go out and try to control things. And that was my job for 4 months of the fair. Wow. And I got to know the whole fair that way because because they assigned us to a different place, and there were different hot spots and different problems here and there, and they're also different problems. The Japan Pavilion had its own problems, and the China Pavilion, and the Arabian Pavilion, and all these had different kinds of problems, and that we could solve by making different kinds of chain lines to put people in mazes to get into the pavilion.
You were a bouncer, Jack.
Yeah, I more or less was. I was a 150-pound bouncer, but I was, but that was fascinating. But then they were trying to save money at the end of the fair, because they thought they were going to lose money, and they started laying off a lot of people in the last like 2 months before the fair. And we were laid off. It happened to be the same day that I had a friend connected to the Egypt Pavilion, and I was. They said, well, actually, we need someone to be a tour guide. Our tour guide's not here anymore, and I said, I don't know anything about Egypt history, but tomorrow I will. And I went to the library and got a dozen books about ancient Egypt history, and I read them all night. And I went in, and I was an Egyptologist the next day, and I wore a blazer and a tie, and I knew all about and I could talk to anybody about any part of Egypt. I knew the pharaohs in order and all this stuff, and it was but the Queen Hatshepsut and all this, it was all these the statuary basically is what their pavilion was, and I could talk about all this stuff, and I came to conclusions of my own and would share them with the visitors too. But I was talking to strangers about ancient Egypt for 2 months. It was what I did in the last couple of years, months of the fair.
Okay, that might be my favorite story from you. That might be my favorite.
But it happened to be in the last week at the fair. I thought, what are we going to do after the fair? I'm still just an unemployed guy who's never had a job that required a college degree. But I met a guy who'd heard about a job opening for an investigator for a criminal law firm, and I applied for that job. I thought, what can I lose? And it turned out they just wanted a guy with a college degree, a young guy who was willing to work for $9,000 a year to go out and ask people questions about crimes, and that's what I did for 2 years. I would go to crime scenes. I would make maps. I would do prepare interviews for the lawyers so they would know in court what the person was going to say before they asked the question. That was my job, to be sure the lawyer was prepared for what this person was going to say, and that was fascinating and harrowing sometimes. But
what was that? And did you like that?
It was a lot of fun. Yeah. I love Perry Mason. I was called Paul Drake for Perry Mason and for Bob Ritchie's firm. But it was that was really fascinating to me. And some days I was just working at the copier, but some days I was listening to an undercover drug sting thing and listening to audio tapes and making notes and transcribing things. But my main job was just to be a guy who ran around and did the footwork for the lawyers, and I would go sometimes drive to other cities and look at guns and things, and just all the evidence of any given crime, and that was a lot of fun. But I really wanted to write, and every day, especially when I was working late, working on the copier, I would look down and see the Arnstein building, which was where we were in West Nile, the Embassy Suite building, the hotel.
Yeah.
Then there was Park Bank building. But I would look down and I would see all these young people about my age, and they were just playing with these big colorful things. And through the window, I could see the Arnstein building way down there, and they were laying out magazines. And I thought, that looks like fun. That I don't have to deal with all this grim stuff, murder and armed robbery and stuff that we deal with all the time. And I began applying there, and it took me like a year of like a dozen applications to finally get a foot in the door. But I finally got to work for Whittle Communications, which made a lot of people don't remember Whittle now, but it was a national magazine company that was here in town, and they made lots of glossy magazines for everything from laundromats. My first job there was to write and research an on-the-wall magazine. It was a giant poster, was what it was, that people could read while they were in the laundromat waiting for their laundry to finish.
Never heard of that before.
And, yeah, it was a great idea. They had a framed poster. It was probably 6 or 8 feet long, that had like an interview with these comedians that I'd never heard of before, like Jerry Seinfeld and people like that. We'd had interviews with people like that before they were famous, right. Often. And then we'd have little jokes and things, and I would write jokes or find jokes and little it was called funnies, and it was all just humor at first. But then I worked for I got to talking to people, and when they started a literary magazine, it was a short story magazine. I got a job as a literary editor, and I was that for 2.5 years. And we put out a quarterly magazine of entirely of fiction. And I got to talk to Isaac Asimov on the phone once, and but got to know a few well-known writers, and that was fascinating.
Do you ever think like 100 years from now there'll be a historian looking at your books to continue on with telling the stories of Knoxville?
Oh well, I would like to think so. They're not really academic books mostly, but I do think my books will be of interest, at least, if not importance, in the future. Yeah. But it's been there's a lot of stuff that we've turned up that really has not been widely known, and would probably take. And we're also catching people before they died in some cases, and I got to interview one of Cormac McCarthy's best friends from childhood right before he died, and he was actually a character in Suttree, the guy who's played J-Bone, And Jim Dykes, I interviewed him for hours as he was a week before he died, about the journalist. He was a very interesting fellow. But if anybody's interested in these folks, I hope they'll find the pieces I wrote about them. But the problem is some of it's not even available online. The corporation that bought us and shut us down also erased Metropulse from the internet. And so you can't find it that easily. They got some kind of legal advice that this was a liability or something. It would make it hard for the corporation to sell their properties to somebody else. And so we thought it was permanent. When we were early adapters to websites. We had a website in the 90s and had everything we ever did on it. And thought, this is great. We don't even have to save paper copies anymore. It's all online now. But now it's not. So, but it's there have been some efforts to try to restore some of it, and there are bits and pieces of it that were saved before it was lost that are online. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. But yeah,
I'm sure
it's media in our time. It's constantly changing and not always for the better.
Last, why stay here in Knoxville? You clearly are good at this, and you could move on to another city and do this, or expand your focus.
Well, I have a background in Knoxville. I'm not sure how easy it would be to move to. Actually, people in a certain corporation suggested I move to Chattanooga about 10 years ago, because they didn't want me competing with what they were doing. But I think it would take some years of background, and for years I didn't make a living as a historian in Knoxville. I was just writing occasionally about it, and it was gathering all that stuff together to make it work. So I think you need a background in history to make a living at it. But also Knoxville is my home, and I think this kind of sore point that Knoxville really, for many years, didn't think much of itself, and our downtown was a dump, and the people were just thought, when they talked about Knoxville, they would say, "Oh, well, yeah, I love the Smoky Mountains,"
right? Which is not Knoxville.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. But I can't. I love I was invited to speak to a group. They said we try to be fair to all of Tennessee, all 4 cities in Tennessee. They say every year we go to a different city in Tennessee: Memphis, Nashville, Chattanooga, and the Smoky Mountains. And they go to Gatlinburg, and they just skipped Knoxville altogether. And Knoxville got skipped that way a lot. And I think just that fact that I'm filling in a gap in a city that has not thought or known much about its history for many years, that's gratifying in a way that I don't think it would be if I were to go to Baltimore or Akron or anywhere else.
We are glad that you stay right
yeah,
here.
Well, me too.
Thank you so much for joining me. Jack
Thank
Neely,
you. Yeah,
Knoxville
Tearsa.
History
I appreciate
Project.
it. Thank
Keep
you.
on writing.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.